Today we have the great good fortune to have a subject that Americans, at least those who don't live north of Canada, pay too little attention to, which is the Arctic. And we have an outstanding quad of talent. We have Admiral Jakob Rousøe, the Defense Attaché of the Kingdom of Denmark, and also the Dean of the Defense Attaché Corps. We have Sara Cohen, the Deputy Head of Mission for Canada here. She focuses on national security policy. Both of them represent governments who are the longest standing treaty allies of our country, and also two of its closest friends. Balzer, our in-house talent. He's a Jeane Kirkpatrick Fellow and studies nuclear issues, is writing a biography of James Schlesinger, among other things. And Jakob Isbosethsen, the representative of Greenland, which is an integral part of the Kingdom of Denmark, is also joining us to talk about these issues today. And we're going to start with me pitching slow and over the middle of the plate. So I want to go straight down the line and have each of you say, why should we care about the Arctic? What's going on there? Admiral.
Well, that's a very good question, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. And first of all, I might just say that the Arctic is something that I feel very strong about, because through my career I've spent a long time there. I've done several deployments with Danish warships, patrolling both Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and being in those waters. And then I've been head of operations in our joint Arctic headquarters in Nuuk, the capital of Greenland, where I've worked very closely with Jakob on the other side here. So why is this important? And not only because I feel strongly about it, it's of course because the Arctic is changing. I think that's a fact. I've seen it. If you live up there, you see it every day. And that has introduced a lot of, I wouldn't say dilemmas, but things that we need to worry about and do something about with regards to security.
Okay, but every place is changing. What's changing in the Arctic that's significant? Why do we need to understand it now when we had the luxury of Canada taking care of understanding it for us previously?
Well, you could argue that for a very, very long time, the Arctic has been a very hostile, difficult place to access, and that part is changing. And because of that, as soon as that changes, human being tends to then go there. And that part is something that we as sovereign nations need to understand what that means. And it comes with responsibility of being able to assist them if something goes wrong, but it also comes with an obligation from our own side to be able to maintain our sovereignty.
Excellent answer. Kyle, what's your answer to this?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Real pleasure to be here with close friends, allies. I'll continue on with the theme of what's changing in the Arctic and why that matters. Threat-based assessment, I guess, which would be the closer cooperation between China and Russia. We see air patrols, bomber patrols. In Alaska's, the U.S.'s exclusive economic zone, you see joint patrols, Chinese, Russian, naval patrols in the Arctic. So really, I think when we need to broaden, zoom out our strategic map. We typically think of European security in NATO's northern flank, the central region, maybe down through the Med, Persian Gulf. And then when we're thinking about China, we see the map, the spatial dimension we think of is the two island chains. But really, I think we need to broaden that out, and the strategic environment for the free world is really the island chains up through the Bering Strait, through the Arctic, through that GI-UK gap, the sea lanes between Greenland, Iceland, and the UK, and then over to the traditional northern flank, Eastern Front. And so the reason why I think we need to think broadly about that is because of just the more traditional, nuclear threats over the Arctic pole. The U.S. can't project power into the Asia Pacific, into those traditional zones in Europe, if it's totally exposed to ballistic missile attacks over the Arctic from Russia, China, and Greenland is obviously crucial to ballistic early warning, radar defense, and that sort of thing. Without that, we'd be pretty exposed to ballistic missile attack. We couldn't extend deterrence and defend our allies. And so I think, if we think about that map, Greenland is really, in many ways, the linchpin of a global free world defense posture. And so I think that's why the Arctic is so critical today.
Good answer. Sara.
Thanks, Kori, and really thank you for the invitation. Real pleasure to be here. I don't have the experience that the Admiral has living and working in the Arctic, but I have to say, in my capacity here as Deputy Head of Mission for Foreign Policy and National Security for the Government of Canada, so many parts of that portfolio, be it the border, be it the conversation about national security, foreign policy, defense policy, migration of peoples, environment, energy and natural resources, the through line very much includes the Arctic and the ability that we have had to work with the US administration during my time here, which is only growing over time given geography, but also given the issues of the day, has been a real highlight of my experience here, and the opportunity to visit Alaska, but also the Canadian Arctic, gives that so much more heft and depth when we're talking about today's challenges in all of those areas. I would say, why is the Arctic important for Canada? Just to situate, and the maps are very helpful, this is 40% of Canada's landmass. This is a population of 150,000 folks spread across cities, but also townships and hamlets and much, much smaller populations. And so you start first and foremost from a Canadian perspective, where this is very much about people and the security dimension of what it means to live in an environment like that, have the dignity and the ability to pursue traditional and cultural traditions, but also to contribute and to have economic well-being and to be kept safe from any threat to, yes, national sovereignty, but also the personal security that goes along with that as a habitant of that part of our country. I couldn't agree more with what has already been said, and it corresponds very closely with Canada's assessment of what is the threat to the Arctic and why this is increasingly the core focus of a number of our policy documents and the orientation that the government is taking in a wide range of areas, but principally in the security space. Just to pick up on previous comments, the collaboration between Russia and China in the Arctic is ever closer and ever more significant as we look at what does it mean to ensure sovereignty, what does it mean to ensure security and stability and economic development for that part of the world in collaboration with our allies, notably the US and Denmark and Greenland and a variety of other players in that space. That close cooperation, the advanced military capabilities that they are bringing to that conversation through submarines, long-range aircraft, hypersonics, increased presence of aircraft and vessels, surveillance platforms. This, to your question, Kori, is what is changing? This is changing at a very accelerated pace. The landscape that is changing is a landscape that is melting 4 times faster than the global average in terms of climate change. And what that means is increased accessibility of natural resources that are present in the area, also increased viability of navigation routes, and that opens the door to increased presence of a variety of actors, 2 of which I've already named, and the real need to look very carefully at how do we ensure the sovereignty and the security and the dignity and the security of people in that space as we face what is a very changing landscape. It also calls on a very different set of requirements for our security forces who are now operating in a rapidly changing physical environment that necessitates a change to the strategic posture. And then finally, underpinning all of this is not unique to the Arctic theater, but is the changing nature of potential conflict and the way in which non-traditional and new and unconventional weaponry can be deployed in that space. That underpins all of our conversations about global security, but the need to map that onto what we've already described as a changing landscape in the Arctic is probably the third principle of what we're seeing and why this comes so far to the fore. Thanks, Kori.
Sure. Jakob.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation, and I'm very happy to be here today. And I'm happy that you highlighted that Greenland is an integral part of the Kingdom of Denmark. As you know, the Kingdom of Denmark consists of 3 countries with 3 different governments, 3 different parliaments, 3 different languages, 3 different cultures, and 3 different cultures and peoples. So we have a very unique construction also compared to the other Arctic states. And that is also the reason why we are sitting here in this panel and with this composition. And to put it in more context, Greenland is the world's largest island. We are around 2.2 million square kilometers in size, with around 80% covered by ice all year long, the inland ice. We have no roads, no trains connecting our cities and settlements. I think we have 78 cities and villages and settlements, mostly along the west coast, stretching almost 2,000 kilometers, which you can see on this very good map, is equal basically from the southern tip of Norway to the beginning of the Sahara in Africa. That's how big Greenland is, and that's the challenges that we have compared to other Arctic states, where you cannot just mobilize or drive with the trucks or whatever. It means that we need to fly by helicopter to do our logistics, or we have to fly with small fixed wings airplanes if we are so lucky that we have a landing strip or an airport. Even above the Arctic Circle, then you need to go with dog sledges if the climate change has not diminished the ice there. So we have some very different perspectives and challenges in Greenland, and which is the Arctic part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And I think when we are talking about, it's important to remember that when we are talking about security in the Arctic, that the Arctic is not just one thing or one region, as my colleagues very well described here also, especially from Canada. We have the Arctic part of Alaska. There's also the whole Arctic part of Russia. We have an Arctic part of Norway and Finland and Sweden as well. Very different constructions. Members of the European Union, members of the Kingdom of Denmark, and you have your own legal framework and constructions in Canada and US. So I think when we are talking about security in Arctic, we need to consider these things also. And then finally, and not to repeat what my colleagues have said, that also from the government of Greenland, we strongly believe that security is important everywhere also, or maybe especially in the Arctic, which from our part is Greenland. And that's also why the government of Greenland has launched our foreign security and defense policy strategy with the title Nothing About Us Without Us, because we cannot talk about Arctic security or Arctic in general without involving the people that actually lives in the Arctic.
Excellent. So my next question, and Kyle, it's going to be unfair to you, but that's my prerogative, which is to ask the 4 of you to describe what your governments are doing in the Arctic. What are you trying to accomplish? What are the major lines of policy? What are you worried about and taking action to shape?
Should I start? Well, thank you for that question. It's a good question. There's been a big change with regard to the Danish government's perspective of the Arctic during the last couple of years, and I think a lot of it has been driven by the posture of Russia and how that has changed with the Ukraine war, and therefore the security in the Arctic we now look upon in a completely different manner that we did some years ago. So what we're doing now is that we are ramping up our capabilities in the Arctic. We have a framework and the biggest that we have had since during my career, a framework defense agreement that is running over 10 years. And in that, we have partial agreements. We earlier this year had a political agreement on the first Arctic package with solid capabilities that are now rolling in, focusing on domain awareness as the first one. Then the capability of conducting more thorough analysis of what we see, and then also strengthening our command and control capabilities with that, and then obviously new capabilities that can be able to react to what it is we see. So that is rolling in now, and our politicians are actually, as we speak, negotiating the next package in that ramp up of capabilities in the Arctic. So from the kingdom perspective, with regards to defense, we want to do more, and we're ramping up that very quickly, and we're doing that as we are also ramping up together with NATO the capabilities in Europe. But all has been driven by what we see from Russia, but then also in some way the aspirations we see from China.
Great. So Kyle, the Trump administration has launched an extraordinary broadside against an American ally by suggesting that Greenland should not be part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but instead should come under American authority. I'm not asking you to defend it, but can you explain it? What's going on there?
I think part of it has to be playing to domestic audiences, projecting a degree of strength amongst immediate supporters. Two, there may be legitimate security concerns. The United States itself has to do more in the Arctic. Our allies have to do more in the Arctic. But we can do that together, and the United States can't do it ourselves. Our allies can't do it ourselves. We really have to pull together our defense industrial bases, because that arsenal democracy we had in World War II, that Detroit deterrent we had in the 1950s for the Soviets, it's not there yet. So if U.S. policy wants to see greater security in Greenland and the Arctic, it's really binding ourselves closer to allies, because I think that is a legitimate concern of the Trump administration. But it would be good to be conscious of the fact that U.S. behavior has cascading effects even beyond the Arctic. For instance, if you look at Ukraine, two audiences that are really glued into Ukraine are South Korea and Japan. I think it's widely known in the world that our closest allies politically, culturally, are in Europe. So if the United States is seen to be taking a maybe negative diplomatic approach with those allies, I think that will weaken any strategy to really prioritize the defense of Asia. So just to round out that answer, I think there's legitimate security concerns that the Trump administration, that their current campaign is all about. But it'd be best to really bind ourselves to allies as opposed to trying to score points maybe for domestic audiences.
So one quick follow-up question. I saw in yesterday's news that the U.S. Department of Defense has moved Greenland from the area of operations of the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the EUCOM commander, to NORTHCOM. Why are they doing that, and what does it mean?
I think the idea is, as I mentioned earlier, with those, with that our most northern installation, military installation in the world, is Greenland. The ballistic missile early warning defense radars. I think the gist of that adjustment is the idea that installation is so important for sensing ballistic missile attacks. First, space-based infrared radars pick those up, the heat signature from ballistic missiles. And that cues that early warning radar in Greenland, which itself cues ballistic missile interceptors to intercept warheads in the mid-course in outer space. So I think that's kind of the thinking behind tying Greenland, including it into NORTHCOM, NORAD, whether bureaucratically or administratively, that's a seamless incorporation, I think remains to be seen, but I think that's the rationale behind it.
Okay, that strikes me as actually a practical reason that doesn't feel ominous. But as with so much of the Trump administration, the context in which they make a seemingly reasonable choice, given the drumbeat of their other behavior, scares horses in the streets. Admiral, you wanted in on this?
No, I just wanted to say that this is not a new thought to change this. I remember at least 10 years ago I had this discussion with NORTHCOM and EUCOM. So this is not a new thought. And having been in that in-between seams for a long time, no matter where you put a seam, you will have challenges with regard to coordination. And we have had close discussions with both the Pentagon and NORTHCOM about how we do this. So I think there are pros and cons in wherever you put these seams. And as you correctly alluded to, the current presence of U.S. troops in Greenland are working predominantly for the homeland defense, and therefore that makes sense in that respect. The other argument you could say is that when you look at NATO and the NATO responsibility, it's still SACEUR that sort of have the responsibility of the whole kingdom, including Greenland. So there is coordination that needs to be made when you change these things, but there was also coordination issues before that. So I think we'll find a pragmatic way of doing this.
Okay, I think that's a really important explanation. You guys have made me feel better about something that I was nervous about. Sara Cohen, tell us about what Canada is doing in the Arctic.
Well, thank you for the opportunity for a bit of self-promotion, Kori. So when we talk about the Canadian approach to the Arctic and what we've seen as a rather enormous ramp up in terms of focus and resources, I'll give you just a very quick overview of where a variety of cascading policy documents situate that, and then I can give you some examples of how that comes to be operationalized. Canada situates its Arctic policy very much through the Arctic and Northern Policy Framework, which came out in the 2017-2018 period, which seeks to cover that range of issues that I described initially that run from domestic to personal to national to international to continental, from the security but also the economic development and the climate and the environmental space. Cascading from that document, we released in April of last year our defense policy update, which is titled Our North Strong and Free. I think the symbolism is very much in the title, but that document, from which our Canadian Armed Forces take the bulk of their direction, very much situates as the top of three priorities Canada's sovereignty in the Arctic and the required investments that it will take to double down on infrastructure, to double down on people, to increase our ability to defend and protect the Arctic. Obviously, the Canadian Armed Forces has as their primary goal to defend Canadian sovereignty and Canadian people, but with a very clear understanding that this is also, as others have described, very much the western and northern flank of NATO. And so that embedded relationship with the transatlantic alliance is very much in there. And then so is, and Kyle has alluded to this, the relationship with NORAD, which in addition to being the home of Commander NORTHCOM, he is double-hatted as Commander NORAD with his number 2 as a Canadian. And that is very much the heart of the Canada-US continental defense domain awareness conversation. Those announcements in Our North Strong and Free obviously build on announcements that came a few years previously on how Canada and the US will work together to modernize NORAD through a joint plan of implementation. And there again, you get very much this conversation about how do you address new threats, new dynamics, the dynamics that I described in the threat assessment earlier, from the perspective of domain awareness on the continent. And that was also a generational investment in modernizing those capabilities. Last week, we also had the announcement by Prime Minister Carney, who is at this point 6 weeks into his most recent mandate, that Canada will reach 2% defense spending this year. That's a full 5 years ahead of schedule, through additional announcements and additional investments that will go towards many of the principles outlined in Our North Strong and Free, with a focus on Arctic investment as well. Others have mentioned that leaders will be together in The Hague next week, and that is an ongoing conversation, again, in the NATO space and in the investment space, very much with the Arctic, again, and the Canadian piece of that as the western and the northern flank. And so what that means in terms of people and what that means in terms of investment is a full suite of offshore patrol vessels, of underwater sensors, of how do you take a look at really modernizing the fleet, investing in icebreakers, how do you maximize Canadian presence in the north, how do you maximize dual-use infrastructure. We are purchasing the planes, we are purchasing the fleet, we are also looking at making sure that the infrastructure is dual-use to reinforce those principles that I described earlier about the people and the sovereignty of them and the opportunities here for economic development in that space. We also have, complementing all of that since December, a explicitly named Arctic foreign policy, and that seeks to update all of the international pieces of that Arctic and Northern policy framework in light of the changing geopolitical reality. The reality in 2017-18, when that document was written, is different now. We have updated the threat assessment. And that looks at also how do you use and leverage all of the tools of traditional diplomacy to have the important conversations with allies, including everybody who I'm sitting here on stage with, also our NATO allies, and also increasingly the conversations that need to happen with North Pacific partners as you look at the reality of the map and you look at what these increased approaches mean and the vested interest that a Japan or a South Korea will have in that conversation. We're also looking at increasing our presence both in Alaska and in Greenland with the reopening of our consulates there. And so you really see the way in which all of the levers that Canada brings to bear to this conversation are building up towards generational financial presence and also infrastructure investments in the Canadian Arctic. It's an interesting time.
Thanks. Jakob, how about you? How's Greenland thinking about what's changing in the Arctic, and what's the government of the island doing about it?
As the Arctic part of the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland, of course, we play a very active role in shaping the Arctic policy. And you can also say, thereby, by per definition, whatever our government does is Arctic policy. We don't have to address it as Arctic policy because we live in the Arctic, so everything we do...
Sort of like the Chinese eating Chinese food, it's just food.
That was your words, I don't know. But, of course, we are increasingly taking a more proactive and visible role in matters of regional cooperation and security together with Denmark. All the things that Jakob mentioned with the Danish government are working on addressing more capabilities, more finance and so on. We are actually doing it for the first time in history together with the government of Greenland and the Danish government on how to secure, with things that you also mentioned on we can have benefits of dual use for new airports or deep seaports and so on. So we are very engaged very closely with Denmark on defense and security policy through our shared foreign and security policy framework. But at the same time also, I can also mention that yesterday the 3 prime ministers of Denmark, Faroe Islands and Greenland met in Tórshavn in the Faroe Islands, where they also discussed the possibility to have a more increased foreign competence and agreed on to further develop the framework, the legal framework of the Kingdom of Denmark. So I think from all 3 countries, both domestically and towards foreign affairs, we are working on to develop these areas. And then again, as I mentioned, Greenland, we are only 57,000 people on the world's largest island in the context that I put in the beginning. So of course, we don't have an army, we don't have anything near what the US, what Canada, what Denmark are. So of course we are very dependent on our friends and allies. And Greenland being part of the Kingdom of Denmark, we are part of NATO, and we are part of the Western Hemisphere. We are part of the Western Alliance. And as you also mentioned, we have the very important Pituffik space base, which is the eyes and ears of interceptions for the homeland security of the United States. And as our Prime Minister have said, with all this political disturbance that has been the last few months, our security is your security. We are interlinked. We already have the defense agreements. We already have the legal framework to work closer together to broaden our cooperation. We have already the framework of the permanent committee, the joint committee, and so on in connection with the security, which we have been working on for many, many years. And in there's all these possibilities that we are talking about also to in the future to intercept the new security awareness.
So let me ask, I guess I'd start with you, Kyle, since you're an historian, but anybody else can help him out on this. Has there historically been a lot of friction between the United States and either the government of Greenland or the government of Denmark about the US bases, about the missions being conducted from the island of Greenland? Anybody?
Yeah, so frictions, we certainly weren't perfect in the Cold War, but with allies, I'd say we batted, about average, 300, which is pretty good in Major League Baseball.
It's above the Mendoza line.
But in terms of, in the Truman administration, for instance, there was some interest in purchasing Greenland. That was, obviously caused some friction with the Danes. But it was eventually decided that would cause too much friction for what the Strategic Air Command, our nuclear deterrence, was trying to do. It would just cause more hassle than it was worth.
So footnote, this is pre-NATO. It's 1947, right?
Yeah, and then into the 50s, the Joint Chiefs of Staff was still very much interested in purchasing Greenland. The Eisenhower administration State Department, again, decided the same as the Truman administration, where that was too much of a political hassle, and for nuclear deterrence to really hold out and to extend deterrence to our allies in Europe, we could not be seen to be purchasing territory that was not for purchase. So yes, there has been some friction.
Any more recent than that? Jakob, you wanted to get in on this.
I think there's definitely some more reason to that. I think everybody is aware of that. And it is a very special situation in connection of what you asked for in the beginning. I think, of course, you also have to see it in a historical, as Carl mentioned, context, and also in our own colonial history context together with Denmark. Before 1953, when we became a legal part of the Kingdom of Denmark with the Constitution of Denmark, before that, we basically had no rights in that sense. But in 1953, we became Danish citizens. So at least on paper, we got some different rights that we had before. And of course, the Second World War was before that. And the early defense agreements between the US and Denmark was made there, where the US were allowed to build military bases in Greenland and so on. And then with the Pituffik space base, of course, there has been some frictions, as mentioned, which has caused many discussions in Greenland and in Denmark, and which can also has been seen as in a historical context as some controversial, and it has been subject to legal court cases within Denmark between Greenland and Denmark, and also what else happened there with the Camp Century project and the secrecy, the B-52's crash in 1968 and the hydrogen bombs and environment and all these things. But I also have to say that is, you can say that was in another time we lived in a different context than we do now, and many things has developed, thankfully, in a much better way. So I would say, despite all these frictions there has been with the US military presence, I think the majority of the Greenlandic people are very satisfied with the US military presence, because as I mentioned before, our security is your security, and together with US and the Danes and with the Joint Arctic Command and all the things that Jakob has mentioned, I think the big majority of the Greenlandic people are satisfied with that and are happy to contribute to the Western Alliance and our partnership with US and Denmark. Then of course, when you have an administration having a rhetoric saying what has been said out loudly, that of course creates some different reactions. Of course. If you are being threatened by your most important and biggest partner, that your country will be taken over, you will not rule out this and that and all these things, then suddenly, of course, people's view on Americans are changing, as you also mentioned a little bit. And that is the first time in history that we are experiencing that before, that we were really happy with that. So I think that is something that you might also need to think about.
I think that's a
when
really
you have been
important point,
threatened
and I'm
like
glad
this,
you made it.
you will create an anxiety in a society, and when you have an anxiety, you will create a reaction, and the reaction will be probably the opposite of what you are trying to gain, and that is very special to experience, I have to say.
I think that's a really important point. Before I open up the floor for questions, I have one more subject I'd like us to touch on, and it's for you, Admiral, which is how concerned, as a Navy man, how concerned are you about the opening up of shipping lanes and the security of Denmark, given the Arctic passage that's opening up?
So I think the biggest concern initially would be the safety of whoever is going up there to operate. I think that what we've seen, as I said before, is that as soon as you get access to places in the world, human being has the tendency to show up, and not necessarily with a lot of experience of being in those areas, and we see that. And I think that is our greatest concern initially. Of course, the security bit is something that we need to keep an eye on, but it's not like that we see a majority of activity in our area of the Arctic. I know that the Chinese and the Russian combined exercises and presence and controls and so on close to Alaska is a big concern, and we follow that very closely. But in our area, it's not the same for now. So the biggest concern is actually to make sure that we can be there and help people out if they get in trouble, because we see that. I think it was 2 years ago, or we saw a cruise ship running aground on the east coast of Greenland, and it was just lucky that there was someone that could help them out. Otherwise, they will perhaps still be stuck there. So it's just to say that I think up there it's all about having the experience and understanding where you are operating initially. Otherwise, you will get in trouble.
Sara, any Canadian perspective on the opening up of shipping routes and concerns about it?
Thanks, Kori. I think I touched on this a little bit at the beginning. The reality of how quickly this is going to happen is driving a lot of the threat assessment and is driving a lot of the investments. And given where we sit and the territory that it is upon us to control and make sure that we are able to participate to, yes, free and open conversations about movement and legitimate travel and legitimate interest by the humans who are interested in coming and seeing these places, and the economic opportunities that this could offer for not only Canada, but a variety of our partners. The balance that needs to be struck so that you are also ensuring full awareness of the domain that we are talking about here, so that we are able to prevent the presence, the uncontrolled, the unregulated presence of malign actors, of questionable investment, of people who are coming to take advantage of principles of free and open trade and free and open navigation for nefarious purposes, very much is driving the balance of the investments that Canada is looking to make in that space.
Thanks. Okay, questions. Whether or not you have one, Mackenzie Eaglin, I know you have experience of the Arctic, and I see you in the room, so I cannot resist wanting you to share your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Kori. Great panel. I really enjoyed it. I love the map, and I'm struck by it. So many questions, and I'm not sure which one I want to go down the route. I had the pleasure of visiting the Arctic Circle in Norway. I think I told Sara last year, and Coast Guard vessel ride up through the Norwegian Sea about 4 hours, and then we're about halfway. Took another flight, and so it was pretty remarkable. There was a Cold War, a closed United States Navy Cold War base that we were able to see briefly on our way up further north, we shuddered, of course, at the end of the Cold War, but it was capable of hosting an aircraft carrier, not that you would necessarily need one up there. But it struck me as hearing all of you talk, do we need to consider additional bases, places, or outposts anywhere in the free Arctic Circle among friends and allies, whether that's any of you here or other partners? As we see Russia and China increasingly plant their flags all over the place, if I can use that term.
Good question. I feel like
Well,
it goes to you first, given you're wearing a uniform.
I think absolutely. Initially, we are doing a lot of that, but it's more reintroducing the bases that we used during the Cold War, and there's a lot of activity. There's a memorandum of understanding being established again with the Faroe Islands and the US. We've seen nuclear submarines pulling into to the Faroe Islands. They haven't been there for quite a while. We are going to see the same in Iceland. So Keflavik is also very active now with the and at the same time we are also looking into supporting with runways, hubs in Greenland in the future that can be used by allied partners, and of course US is a very big portion of the activity that's happening in Greenland. So I think we're reopening a lot of these things. We're also looking at the map again, whether all these changes with regards to where you can get access, whether that introduce new things. But I still have to say that there's still a lot of ice up there. It's still really difficult to get around, especially on the East Coast. So I have been in discussion with people that said, could we open a deep harbor port on the East Coast because it will help our operations. We could, but it would be very difficult to establish it. It would be very difficult to operate anything in there. But I think we should have that discussion of how we do this together, because logistics is absolutely crucial up here. If you don't get that right and your supplies and so on, you cannot do anything.
Sarah, I have heard you on this subject before with some virtuosity. Would you like to add to that?
Virtuosity. I don't know if that's a compliment, Kori. Mackenzie, thanks for the question, and I am still committed to getting you out to the Western Arctic, which I maintain is quite different from the European Arctic. I'll leave it to military strategists to opine on the specific question of actual bases. What I will say for the Canadian perspective is, of course, we have the ability for Canadian military presence in Alert, in Resolute. We are based out of Yellowknife with Joint Task Force North, and all of the investments that I outlined, principally the Northern Operational Support Hubs and a variety of the sensors and then the infrastructure around them, gets at, I think, the problem that we're trying to solve with this question, which is about presence and about domain awareness. So I'll leave it to others to determine if whether a base is sort of the next step in that space. But so much of what we are looking at from the Canadian angle is maximizing presence and maximizing awareness, doing that in concert with the variety of rights holders who live in the North. And then I just wanted to pick up on the Admiral's point, because it's very important, that underlying thread of interoperability and interchangeability with allies. As you go to purchase these things, as you go to build these things, making sure that if we are in a scenario where these are joint engagements, that we are not coming up against unnecessary hurdles from a logistical perspective and from a very practical perspective.
So Kyle, can I ask you, from either a missile defense, strategic defense perspective, or from operations necessitated by deepening Russian and Chinese cooperation. Do you see further requirements?
Yeah, I was going to add, to answer this question, if we can implement some of the Admiral's suggestions or potential options to maximize the domain, the presence, the domain awareness, to stress the Russian Navy. They tend to bastion their forces in the Barents Sea, Kola Peninsula. So if we can, put a little stress on that and keep them bastioned instead of surging through the GI-UK gap, because our homeland is no longer a sanctuary. It never has been. So if we have Russian naval forces surging into the North Atlantic, cruise missiles, land attack cruise missiles holding at risk the US homeland, it becomes much harder to defend allies in Europe, in Asia. So yeah, if we can follow through with some of those suggestions and really maximize our presence, I think that would be very worthwhile.
Anybody else? Yes. And please introduce yourself. Right up here.
Hi, my name is Natalia. I'm an intern with the China Select Committee on the Hill, and I'm a student at the University of Florida. So this conversation, you talked about increasing access to the northern sea route. Obviously, the Bering Strait is a strategic maritime choke point, and what I keep thinking about is historical comparisons to the Bab al-Mandeb in Africa. So what lessons can we learn from, obviously, the race to that strategic maritime choke point between China, Russia, the United States, and other countries around the globe, so that when we're creating a forward-thinking Arctic strategy, we take those lessons learned and we apply to that, especially as this conflict appears to be moving into our own backyard?
That is a super impressive question. Good use of history, good strategic perspective. Okay, who wants to field that brushback pitch?
I think we need more. I think we learned in the Middle East, as you referenced, with that strategic strait there, the need for more mass, whether that's munitions. I think in the Arctic, for example, we need more precise mass with autonomous vehicles, underwater vehicles, aerial vehicles. And this gets back to my earlier point with our defense industrial base, not just the United States, but our allies in Europe, South Korea, Japan, Finland is the superpower of ice breaking. So if we pool those resources together, I think we can get that precise mass that we need, that we didn't have at that strategic choke point in the Middle East.
Excellent.
And can I just add to that?
Please.
That we've been talking about changes up here because of climate is changing. But I think another thing that is changing rapidly as well is also the technologies that we see that we can use, and that is also changing what we can, both how we can expose the Arctic, but also what we actually can do with capabilities and military capabilities. So I think what we now get is a much better appreciation of what's going on than we would traditionally have had, like that choke point in the Middle East. So now we'll be able to react much quicker, much faster, and we'll be able to get more out of our capabilities and position them in the right way and prevent things from happening before they actually mature. And I think that is an important point to also make.
Excellent. Yes.
Hi, my name's Noah Levy. I'm an intern for Congressman Steny Hoyer, so a lot of admiration for the Danes. My question is about what the real concern is. So we talk a lot in this panel about the actual threats to the homeland, which is always a critical threat. That's why you mentioned we need more bases. But I don't see the concern with Russia attacking any of these homelands because they're already embroiled in a war, and I think the U.S. Is too big of a threat that they would, be involved with that. Where I see a big concern is actually controlling the, water routes. And China has, now the biggest navy in the world, what are the main strategies you all think would be prudent to actually counter, the Chinese Navy superiority to most of the world?
That's a fabulous question. Kyle, do you want to start us, or Admiral?
Sure, I can add a brief comment to that. In terms of the Russian threat, the Russian threat really, it doesn't have to be anything kinetic. Like I mentioned earlier, it could be surging through those sea lanes and just holding at risk targets. 5 years ago or so, leading naval officials, senior naval officials in congressional hearings said that Russia was near a capability to have an enduring presence off our coast with attack submarines. In 2024, they said that capability is here. And I think that plays into your question about China, which is if Russia, is holding targets at risk on our coast, that makes, it much more difficult to just, do the prioritization strategy out there, which is focusing basically exclusively on China, which will be very difficult if we can't maintain relations with our allies and dealing with that Russian threat. So to get to your question about managing the China threat would be taking care of the Russian threat, keeping the Russians bastioned up in the Arctic, binding ourselves to our NATO allies there, so we can focus, shift what resources we may have to shift to deal with the Chinese Navy.
So I can't resist the temptation to also answer. And my answer is a bigger Navy. We need a bigger Navy, and not by a little, by a lot. I endorse Kyle's point that the United States cannot get to the economy of scale of dealing with the challenges China's expanded Navy creates for our own security without deep, intensive cooperation with allies, particularly the two allies represented on this panel.
Can I just stress then also, obviously, as an admiral, I find your point of needing a bigger Navy, that makes sense. but I also will say that the current American administration has made this one of their number one priorities to stimulate the shipbuilding here. And I think that is absolutely right. I think that is very much needed. And as you've seen the numbers of how quickly the Chinese fleet is growing, and that is something that we need to fix. But we need to fix it together. I think if we combined some of the skill sets of designing ships that we have among us with the technologies that we see in the US and the experience of building ships as we see in Asia with a lot of the allied partners there like Japan and South Korea, I think that triangle would actually be able to create something. And this is not just numbers, it's also quality. So I think being smarter, using these technologies and then combining it so we can use our capabilities together will fix this. But we are in a hurry. We need to do something now. But I also hear that from the administration here in town.
Yeah, that's a nice point. Okay, we have time for one last question.
Hi, thank you so much for the great remarks. My name is Gus Desch. I'm a legislative assistant on Capitol Hill. I work for Congressman Warren Davidson, who sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Over the last decade, looking at the Pacific, we see this unfortunate trend, especially in the Pacific, of these small island countries like compacts of free association in the Marianas, where malign actors like the Chinese, for example, roll into these islands and through bribery, political corruption, illicit finance, and investment, exert a lot of force for very cheap. And regardless of what the broader geopolitical future of Greenland and the Arctic looks like, I think an area of enormous shared interest for the US and the Danes and Greenlanders is keeping out the Chinese and the Russians. My question is, what are the Danes and Greenlanders doing to keep out this malign influence from the Chinese and Russians? And how can the US work productively with them to keep out this malign influence from the Chinese and Russians?
Great question.
I think Jakob
Jakob,
should
why don't we start with you?
Yeah, there's many aspects in that question, and thank you for asking that. I think from the perspective of Greenland, you cannot compare it to these small Pacific island states and what has been done there and what they have been cooperated with China there and others. It is something completely different in respect to Greenland. As I mentioned, we are part of the Kingdom of Denmark. We are a very strong democracy, and we have had a long history of working and developing our democracy within the Nordic model together with the Faroe Islands and Denmark, and as we have with other Nordic countries. And then again, we are so close or in the middle between Europe and US, and by the last 80 years, we have had the US military presence in Greenland. We already have the framework to work together with that. Also combined with some of the questions that has been already here, that if the military or the intelligence service thinks that we should increase the American presence, or as the Danes are doing now, upscaling the presence, we already have the framework to do so, and there will be a political discussions between US, Greenland, and Denmark to do so. Also, what you mentioned in relation to with climate change, with new sea routes and so on, are creating of opportunities. But we will not compromise our security. We will not compromise our friendship and alliance with Europe, with the Kingdom of Denmark, with US. Whatever will happen in the future, what you also asked for, our strongest and most important partners will be the Danish government, will be the European Union, will be USA, will be Canada, both in terms of trade, both in terms of security, and so forth. And there's no desire in Greenland to change that. I mean, with our...
So it sounds like the subversion concern is much less because of the long-standing vibrancy of democracy in Greenland, and also its connection to Denmark.
I will just like to add that Greenland is not part of the so-called Polar Silk Road. We are not part of the Belt and Road, and we have no intention to be so. So this concern, if that Greenland will be an example of what has happened in other places, I don't see that as a realistic thing at all.
Great. Admiral, how about you?
Well, of course, I agree in what Jakob is saying, and I think also there's a strong point in saying that this is not new to us. We have for many years worked on identifying investments and figuring out where they're coming from. And if there has been investments that has had Chinese money in it, we've been very strict of not introducing it. So, and there's a number of cases where we've seen that have been tried with regards to the airport infrastructure and so on, and that's been stopped in that way. So I think we are very mature in that way, moving on with it, and the Greenlandic government is very aware of it as well. So, and then I also think there's a point, and I don't know whether, but it's a small community. You know, it's not like, it seems like you can come in and then you can disguise yourself, and then you are there as a Chinese. That would be recognized, I tell you. They know each other, so there's not these things happening. I think sometimes we sort of talk it up to something that is not the case. We take it very seriously, but at the same time, we don't see it at the moment. There's no investments as we see it, and there are no one that is just turning up or showing up or as such.
So my friends, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Won't you join me in thanking Jakob, Sara, Kyle, and Jakob for their expertise and for being such great allies.
Thank you.